My name's Roger Berkowitz. I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College, and thrilled you're all with us for this conference, Rage and Reason, Democracy Under the Tyranny of Social Media. We're here for 2 days, and those of you following online, I look forward to hearing from you as well. You can ask questions in the chat, and we'll also attend to those to the extent we can, although we are trying to get as many of the questions in the room answered. Anyway, I'm thrilled to be up here now with Will Davies. In 2018, you know, people always wondered, do book reviews sell books? And I think most people say no is the answer. But I was doing something that I sometimes do, is reading the New York Review of Books, and I started reading this review of Will Davies' book, Nervous States. And it was one of those things like, I have to read this book. It was clear to me, we were working on some similar things. I was teaching a course on the loss of expertise and the death of experts. And there was just some things in the review, I haven't gone back and looked at it, that made me, and so I ordered the book. And you know, every once in a while you have that experience where you start reading a book and you're like, this book speaks to you. And that was my reaction and my feeling when I first came to this book, Nervous States. It's not his only book. He's also written The Happiness Industry and The Limits of Neoliberalism, probably amongst others. Will Davies is a columnist for The Guardian. Yeah, and the London Review of Books, two esteemed publications across the pond. And he comes to us today from Goldsmiths University in the UK. So I'm thrilled you're here. Welcome. And we're going to have a short conversation and then open it up to you guys to participate as well. So, you know, as I said, I was teaching a course on experts. The book is, in many ways, well, it's called Nervous States, and Nervous States is, as I understand it, something along the lines of where we're left when the supremacy and common sense applicability of reason and a rational public discourse is lost, and suddenly we're like, oh my God. And there's people who believe this and people who believe this. There's false facts. There's this. And we're in this nervous state. Do I have it right? What is a nervous state? How do you pick this title? What do you mean by it?
Thanks, Roger. And thanks very much indeed for the very generous invitation and introduction today. It's really terrific to be here at this fascinating conference. I mean, your brief encapsulation is a good one. I mean, I think that's a good entry point to the thesis in the book. I think that one way of explaining this is to say that, as many of you may have suspected, this title, Nervous States, is a pun. So it's got a couple of different meanings. The first would be concerning how we understand ourselves as social and political actors. And part of this is the sense in which, over recent decades, we've increasingly come to understand ourselves as, not as under classical modernity, as beings that are bestowed with minds, that is, as psychic beings, but increasingly as neural beings, that is, as those who are endowed with a physical capacity to sense the world, to react to the world, to respond emotionally to the world. As anyone who's followed debates in the neurosciences over the last 30 years will know, it's a crucial part of the progress in neurosciences, in the work of people like Antonio Damasio, that as understanding of the brain has advanced, there's a growing recognition that all thought, not just what we call emotional thought, but that all thought is rooted in emotions, in feelings. And this is, I think, in many ways substantially changed our understandings of human agency and what rationality might mean. The second implication of the nervous state is of the political state, in which the meaning of violence and the definition of warfare is increasingly hard to distinguish in various ways. And so one of the things I'm interested in the book is that the basis on which we seek to the grounds of civil society, which throughout the history of political modernity back to the 17th century has been rooted in the promise of peace, the promise of a shared constitutional and legal world, admittedly only within the borders of the liberal Eurocentric world, not outside of those borders, which is a very important point, but that we live in a state where the grounds, the possibilities, and the definition of violence have undergone various changes and have become less certain. This is not a rapid thing. This is not something that's happened overnight, but it's something that has disrupted our politics in various ways. And I just want to add two other things to that briefly. The first is that the reason I think about these two things side by side is that what you can see by thinking about these things side by side is a kind of interlocking crisis of representation that is absolutely central to the broader crisis of liberalism today. I mean, the book was born out of that very disorientating time in 2016 when there was a lot of sort of anxiety and nervousness regarding the state of liberalism in various Western societies, such including my own, the UK, when the Brexit referendum happened. And one of the things people were very aware of was that that this seeming crisis of liberalism was also had these kind of epistemological dimensions. It was a crisis also of knowledge, of rationality, and of expertise. It seemed not simply that people were losing faith in the liberal project as a legal constitutional one, but also as an epistemological one of expertise and of rationality. So that's what we see by thinking about these things side by side, are the different aspects of this crisis of representation. The second thing I want to say, and this is really, I think, another sort of way of defining the nervous state, is that one of the themes running through the book, and we can explore this more in detail, is that how knowledge is valued today is increasingly at odds with how knowledge is valued in the classically liberal project. Within the classically liberal project, the benefit and the virtue of knowledge from a kind of pragmatist perspective is that it provides the grounds of some kind of consensus. It provides a shared reality, a shared world, a shared sense of the facts of what is going on. Increasingly, in an era of not just social media, but also things like financial markets that move very rapidly, and various kind of media that move at a kind of superhuman speed, increasingly we value knowledge for the speed with which it reaches us and the speed with which we are able to respond to it. So you think of sort of high-frequency trading, but the reason why people invest so much money in these cables going under the Atlantic is because it gives them a split-second advantage over their rivals, and they can make money with the movement of prices. In some ways, what social media has done to civil society is a kind of belated mimicking of what computer networks had already done to financial markets from the 1960s onwards. So the issue of speed and the reconfiguring of political and social life around a valorization of rapid response is another way into this same phenomenon of the nervous state. So there's lots of different aspects of the book, which we can unpack quite a few of those there.
That's great. One of the things that I love about the book, the Will's book, is that he goes and unearths, and I mean that in a sense of digs under some of these modern phenomena and finds their antecedents in classical thinkers. And so in this part you were just talking about this counter between speed and competitive advantage. The thinker I think you turn to in the book is Clausewitz, the great thinker of war. War is politics by other means. And you say that for Clausewitz, what every good politician needs, and you say that Napoleon loved this about Clausewitz, is not knowledge but resolution. And writing that in 2016 must have been incredibly, pregnant with meaning, because we were witnessing a situation in which if you just say it enough times and you say it as if you believe it, it's more present in the world, more powerful in the world than any kind of knowledge or truth. Is that true?
Well, I think it's interesting. So Clausewitz was a Prussian general. He was also a philosopher. He was someone who celebrated war with great passion. He was very impressed by Napoleon and how Napoleon had roused emotions that were not otherwise known as being possible at such scale, which Clausewitz interestingly credited that also sort of indirectly to the French Revolution, that it was the rousing of a revolutionary nation that created the popular conditions for the mass mobilization, not of the sort of trained soldiers that Clausewitz's compatriots in Prussia had prided themselves on their sort of skill and their sort of discipline and so on, but instead what Napoleon was able to do was to mobilize great passions at great scale amongst people who may not be very skilled, but nevertheless were willing to get behind a flag because there was a national flag to get behind in a way that was previously unthinkable prior to the French Revolution, and this was Clausewitz's claim. In terms of this point about resolution, I mean, one of the contrasts I'm interested in the book is between this a sort of classically liberal situation in which peace has been established via the state, and certain knowledge claims can be made and tested, evaluated, peer-reviewed, discussed, deliberated, added to, disproven, whatever. That the progress of science, as we sort of celebrate it, the progress of science under civilian conditions, is one in which there is enough time and enough security in order to both collect data, evaluate data, engage in careful measurement, observation. The eye is the sort of sensory organ that we think of probably first and foremost when thinking about science, the observation, the looking on at the experiment. What Clausewitz was interested in was a type of knowledge and a type of leadership which was completely different from that. Because for Clausewitz, under conditions of warfare, and this was, obviously what he was writing about, there is no time in order to engage in that kind of careful, methodical, procedural establishment of facts. And there is no time for those facts to be carefully disseminated via newspapers or peer review or any of the sorts of things. We know how long peer review takes. Instead, the question is how to establish clarity in this terrible, what is often referred to as the fog of war, the noise. How to create what is, in information theory in the 20th century became called extract the signal from the noise. And part of the way in which a leader is able to establish truths under conditions of great uncertainty, great complexity, fast-moving situations, threats, dangers, and so on, is to impose their own personality on a situation and to back their own judgment. One of the lines in Clausewitz that I find so interesting when thinking about the distinction between this militarized vision of knowledge versus a civilian scientific vision of knowledge is that for Clausewitz, the most important, he uses this metaphor that a great leader has the ability to scent out the truth. So suddenly the nose becomes the more important organ, not the eye. And if you think about that, something quite interesting about, if you imagine that the immediacy of smell, the instant recognition of smell, but also the difficulty of actually kind of using the nose as the grounds of scientific proof or evidence. Instead, it is a navigational aid that offers instant certainty and offers the capacity to provide leadership and clarity where otherwise there is just uncertainty. Now, if you think about this kind of knowledge in, obviously that he's talking about warfare, but one of the things that I think is very interesting when you think about these different varieties of knowledge today, it's in a way that's what the kind of knowledge that, say, a business guru might provide, or the charismatic leader, or for that matter, the demagogue. What they offer is not the capacity of reason to be able to walk through various steps of evidence gathering, assessment, critique, sharing, more critique, more peer review, but instead, what they offer is the instinctive and immediate knowledge of what is fundamentally true in an otherwise overwhelming and confusing circumstances. So the reason I turn to Clausewitz is, clearly there's danger in that kind of writing, but also because I think it offers us ways of interpreting leadership and a sort of the alternative to expertise that is available under conditions of politics that often feel as much like war as they do like civil society.
Thank you. I want to turn to the chapter that you call The Birth of Expertise, which is the chapter that really sort of first caught me. And it's about the 17th century, and the 17th century plays a pivotal role in your story, and so hope you'll say a little bit about that. But you set up this conflict between Hobbes and the British Royal Society. Hobbes, as we all know, is a political philosopher. Life is what, nasty Brutus in short. I know I got that wrong. And you call him sort of the philosopher who wants philosophy and science to lead to a peaceful consensus, right? And that this will come through math or mathematics or geometry, not through moralistic speculation. Hobbes has very little faith in our ability to come to a consensus based on opinion, right? You know, it's either science or basically you need an absolute state to say here's what's true, or a general in Clausewitz's sense, right? To say here's what's true. Whereas, and so Hobbes sets up this idea that you call it the state guarantees trust. The Royal Society comes along, right? Society of Letters, and they say we can create trust outside the state. This is my reading of it. You tell me where I get it right or wrong. And if we can create trust outside the state, how are we going to do that? Well, we need experts. We need people who can look at the world, observe the world, and yeah, they may disagree. They may have different. One might be, you know, from Wales, and one may be from the UK, you know, from England, but they'll use a method, the scientific method, and they'll come to some sort of a trustworthy common view of the world based on facts and our observation of facts. Oh, excuse me. Please keep your phones off because we have a YouTube stream, and if they go on, it could cause trouble. So please do silence your phones. So as I understand the argument is that Hobbes says we need an absolute ruler. We need an absolute state to tell us what the truth is, what's our consensus. The Royal Society comes along and says, no, experts and scientific method can come around and create a trustworthy idea. And yet, what your take on this is that from the 17th century up until sometime, if I understand it, around mid-20th, late 20th century, the Royal Society won this war, this debate, and expert knowledge took over and became a trustworthy form. And the argument you're making is no longer. It's gone. We no longer, I mean, you have this great line where you said, Trump reclaims the nation from the elites. So you read Trump as the Hobbesian return of the need to have a nation, right, insist on what's common and not the elites who do science through the scientific method. All right, that's fascinating because what it says is, if in your reading, this 300-year experiment in expert-driven public consensus is over. Is that right?
So it's difficult to draw lines where you say that something, you know, has at what point has something kind of succeeded and at what point has it been defeated. I think just to go back to that point in the mid-17th century, I think the reason I think it's interesting to go back to these times now is, of course, what Hobbes and other modern thinkers were responding to and trying to tackle in the middle decades of the 17th century, or the second half of the 17th century, was finding secular grounds for common life, consensus, politics, agreements of various kinds, as an alternative to the religious, the horrifically costly, bloody religious conflicts that had torn Europe apart in the 30 Years' War and also in the English Civil War. So there's a sort of common ground, and I think one of the ways of approaching this the project that was common to Hobbes and these early experts, and this is where actually I think Arendt is potentially kind of relevant here. Arendt, someone will have to tell me exactly where she talks about this, but there's maybe it's the human condition that promise making, the capacity to make promises, is a kind of central capacity of politics, almost like a sort of universal kind of problem of politics, how to make and to keep promises. Nietzsche says some rather less flattering things about this as well. But sort of, in some sense, it's the grounds of our sort of self-enslavement, is the breeding an animal capable of keeping promises is being the point of morality. But so for Hobbes, the only way people can keep promises is once the problem of violence and mistrust has been solved through the centralization of all power in the hands of this Leviathan state that will be a sovereign and a lawmaker. And once this sovereign lawmaker has seized all capacity for power, a kind of overwhelming might, greater than any countervailing power, once that's been done, and once everybody within that society knows that that state exists, and everyone in that society knows that that state will enforce the law and will punish people for breaking the law and so on, trust becomes possible, promises become possible, because it's mutually recognized that those who break the law will be punished for it. So it's a kind of solution to a prisoner's dilemma type problem, which is, because I know that you know, and you know that I know that you know, that that state over there is the source of all power in our society, we can do all sorts of other things together on that basis. We can trade together, we could engage in scientific studies, we can do all sorts of things. We can have debates, we can have disagreements. Because that state has solved the problem of violence, it is therefore possible that promises can start to be made in a reliable fashion. The grounds of the English empiricists, such as those in the Royal Society, but not just those, we're not just talking about the sort of early scientific experiments. Also, you might look at sort of early mercantile communities. You know, I talk in the book as well about some of the early financial communities, insurance brokers in London, early uses of probabilistic modeling. Anyone who's looked at the history of statistics will know, you know, there's a very fertile period in the use of mathematics and the use of model building and data collection to create things like insurance products and to start building statistical models of society and this sort of thing, is that it might be possible within a select group of people to establish grounds of trust on the basis that people are credible witnesses and are credible, methodologically endowed elites of one kind or another, so that experts will be able to trust other experts because they recognize each other as members of this select group of people. So, you know, economists might have nothing in common, but they come together at a conference and they all speak a common language, they have similar credentials, they have similar methods, they are able to trust what one another has said on the grounds that they are members of this same self-selecting community. Now, as anyone who's read Stephen Shapin's work on this will know, I mean, one of the kind of ironies, or it's not really an irony, it's just a sort of historical quirk of the early expert communities in London in the late 17th century was that they effectively behaved, they borrowed the norms of the gentlemen's clubs that were set up at a similar time, which were by definition exclusive. Part of the way in which these communities developed, and you know, we see this in universities to this day, whether we like it or not, was through forms of exclusivity, that not anyone could join them. So that on some level, the capacity to establish trustworthy knowledge within these communities was predicated on the fact that they recognized each other as members of the gentry, they recognized each other as sort of honest gentlemen, but partly because not anyone could join. So they were sort of, and expert communities remain innately democratic entities, sorry, innately anti-democratic entities, in the sense that trust is built by virtue of closure of the community. But nevertheless, this was a kind of direct challenge to the claim that the only basis on which trust is possible, promise-making is possible, was the modern state. So these are sort of rival origins of the project of political rationality, if you like. One of the things that I think, to come back to your question, one of the things that in the book I think has become so damaging for the liberal project in various ways is that the relationship between these two different centers of power, these two different centers of legitimacy, has at various times been quite vague in various ways. So the state, one of the things that sort of characterizes the modern state is that while the modern state may possess sovereignty of various kinds in a sort of classically Hobbesian sense, it also possesses makes various sort of epistemic, various expert claims of legitimacy, that it is able to know what is best for us, it is able to create models of, you know, the macroeconomy of society, of sort of, you know, the distribution of health risks and this sort of stuff. So the state is both a legal sovereign actor, but it is also an expert actor staffed by various elites, civil servants, administrators, social scientists, economists, and this sort of thing. And very often I think the legitimacy of the state, whether or not which part of this is actually the grounds of trust in society, often become quite unclear. And I think what we have seen, particularly since the financial crisis, in many, and particularly since the bailout of the banks in 2008, and in the Eurozone, particularly under conditions of austerity since 2010, is that very often it seems and feels as if the sovereign claims of the state and the expert claims of the state have sort of collapsed into each other in various ways, as if the state is staffed by these sort of sovereign experts, these kind of people who simply believe as if they're better than you and that they're more powerful than you and they know more than you and don't challenge them because they know stuff, and that they have the capacity to make these kind of sovereign decisions by virtue of the fact that they have, PhDs in economics from MIT or whatever it might be. I mean, that's kind of how central banks work, right? Is that they are staffed by people who have both a sovereign power, but they also have a sort of academic credential, which kind of, at a certain point, kind of fuses into a single form of power for which we have no real kind of name other than technocracy. And I think that, in particular, is what inspires rage and anger on both the left and the right, is a sort of a kind of legitimacy that seems absolutely pure and unquestionable in the eyes of the actors concerned, and perhaps in the eyes of various sort of liberal supporters who also might attend some of the same universities and occupy the same kind of cultural milieu and so on, but seems the grounds of which have become very, very blurred. And I think that I think is something that has happened quite acutely since 2008.
I think that's very true. I mean, I don't know how much you follow the United States ins and outs on this, but there was a very important Supreme Court decision about 30, 40 years ago called Chevron, which has probably become, it's the reason Justice Gorsuch was appointed to the Supreme Court, to overturn it, and it's become the sort of touchstone of much of our Supreme Court debates right now, outside of other issues like abortion, which is to what extent the U.S. Congress can outsource legislation to administrative agencies and civil service agencies. And I think you're right. Much of the resentment on both the left and the right against our government right now is a resentment against experts who are more and more seen as sort of the shadow government, or what's called the deep state, on both the left and the right in the government. I mean, it reminds me of Arendt's, in a completely other vein, argument that one of the sources of 19th century anti-Semitism was the association of Jews with the state, because they were given privileged positions in the state as state court bankers. And it strikes me that a lot of the anti-elitism and anti-expert feeling you're seeing now is in a sense analogous to that.
Yeah, I mean, there's another line of Arendt's that springs to mind here, and I think it's on Truth and Politics, where she talks about there's nothing more suspicious than the person whose claims of truth have somehow magically coincided with their political interests, which, I mean, we see this again, particularly in financial management. I mean, the UK right now is going through this astonishing experiment that is reaching its conclusion, where for about 3 weeks, our very right-wing government has decided to ignore everything that economists, the IMF, even Janet Yellen got involved in this, saying, you can't do these things because they are and it's odd that this came from the right. It looks like in the next few days, the British government is going to have to sort of accept that they can't do these things. But that there is, this something kind of deeply sort of troubling about orders that come down on high, not on the grounds that these things are the law, or that they are representations of the kind of collective will, but on the grounds that they are perfectly backed by truth and claims and also of what is rational to do. That if one is to step outside of these things, one is behaving somehow sort of irrationally, which of course is to invite I think necessarily a sort of, in some sense, a sort of, well, okay, if you want me to be irrational, then I'll show you irrationality.
So I'm gonna open it up in a second. I have one last question, and this is sort of, I call this the do you fight fire with fire question. If your argument is, right, that in some sense for 300 years we've built up this effort to create trust and epistemological consensus through science and technology, and that's failed. That there has been shown that the clubs, the gentry clubs, the academic clubs, the government clubs are largely insular and anti-democratic, and they have lost their legitimacy. And that people no longer accept what scientists say. Do we then say, okay, we're all just on Twitter? We're all just another voice, and it's all about who can speak the loudest with the most resolve. I mean, I told you that there was a debate that happened in this country in the 1930s around the rise of fascism in Europe, and the debate was, should the United States, in a sense, should thinkers and politicians in the United States try and argue rationally against fascism, or was that a fool's errand and you should argue propagandistically against fascism? I think a lot of people on the left and even on the right are asking that same question today. Are you, in a sense, a fool if you say, that's false facts, that's an alternative facts, come back to reality? Should you be engaging in an all-out propagandistic war? Or which you think, or do you, in a sense, hold on to some vision of rational, truth-based discourse, which you say is no longer a meaningful idea?
Well, I don't support the idea of heading for all-out propagandistic war. I mean, this is obviously, I recognize the dilemma, and I think it's something that many political parties, particularly on the sort of liberal left, are sort of asking themselves at the moment when faced with some of the sort of tactics being deployed on the right. One of the reasons I wrote the book, I suppose, was to try to understand what it might even have been in the first place that we valued about consensus and the potential consensus-forming capacities of scientific knowledge, and to put it back into a sort of history, and to adopt a perspective that derives originally from pragmatism, really, which is to recognize that to try and think about what knowledge does for us, rather than kind of is knowledge sort of true or false, but does knowledge allow us to live the kind of lives that we want to live? And I think that whether or not we call ourselves liberals or not, I mean, the term liberal, I know, has all sorts of, some people go, don't call me a liberal, this is an outrageous slur for some people. I'm not particularly invested in whether or not we call this liberalism or not, but nevertheless, the sort of central problem that Hobbes and others faced in the mid-17th century of how we live alongside each other in a common world without slaughtering each other seems to me something that is still and will remain a central problem of politics. And that is the backdrop to the question of what kinds of knowledge and what kinds of expertise and what kinds of authority we should seek to reinforce and to endorse and to build. Now, one way to think about this is to make a distinction, as people like Max Weber and followers of Max Weber have done, between rationality and reason. And if you think about the kind of etymology of these terms, rationality has the word ratio in it. It implies something, to my ears anyway, something mathematical, that to say this is being rational and this is being irrational has something which regards the kind of weighing up of different things. So economics is rational to the extent that it's good at weighing up costs and benefits, or accounting is rational to the extent that it's able to put assets and liabilities together on the same sheet of paper. But it, I think, privileges maths in various ways. And by the same token, it potentially facilitates the grounds of a sort of hyper-rationality and then a hyper-accelerated rationality, which is the grounds of digital computing. And this itself, this idea of I dream of a kind of hyper-rationality, you know, the computer originates in war, not in peace. The computer is, I talk about this in the book, the birth of the computer is, as many of you will know, it originates in the need to kind of, you know, train anti-aircraft weaponry and MIT in the 1940s. So there's a sort of dream of a kind of rationality that will get better and faster and more powerful. Reason, the term reason, we think of reason, we could think of the reasons that we have for doing something. And this still implies something potentially ethical and political. And I think this is where the kind of, you know, this Weberian distinction, which becomes also quite important for certain members of the Frankfurt School and so on. I think it's still something that we can do something with, and we can think about what are the reasons why we might trust this climate scientist over this, random YouTuber, and think about what kinds of reasons the climate scientist has for believing what they believe to be true, and the reasons they're giving for why we should do what they suggest we should do. Now, that obviously places huge burdens upon the scientific community to become good at some of that kind of work. There are various, people working in the public communication of science, people like Roger Pielke Jr. and others who uses this idea of the scientist as the honest broker, the person who can actually mediate knowledge in a trustworthy way. Now, it's the crisis we face in relation to the authority of expertise is as much a crisis of our media and of our democracy as it is of scientists as such. I mean, one of the interesting things that I mentioned this in the book, to the extent that they're useful, these surveys that are done on trust by places like the Pew Institute and others show that in the United States, which thinks of itself as this very kind of divided blue state, red state, culture war based society, nevertheless, trust in scientists themselves is incredibly high, actually. It's trust in journalists and politicians that is incredibly low, and that's true in many societies across the world. So it may be that actually it's not the centers of expertise as such, it's about the ways in which centers of expertise are integrated into our public sphere and integrated into our broader circuits of democratic deliberation. Now, those are not easily fixed by any means, but I'm not suggesting that, and this is not, I think, what my book is intending, that we simply sort of turn ourselves purely into, we say, okay, it's now troll warfare, and we either play troll warfare or we get beaten. There may be places where forms of troll warfare are needed. There may be sort of grounds for certain sort of dirty tactics in politics. I think it would be naive to think that dirty tactics in politics will ever be absent, or that they can somehow politics is possible without them. I mean, in your opening remarks, you talk about sort of Machiavelli's account of, and it's like we're all hypocrites, and unless we accept hypocrisy, of course, yes, there will just be a sort of this blanket rage. But I think that by thinking through some of the sort of existential and moral reasons why we have tried to construct institutions of trust and promise-making, and why some of our existing institutions of trust and promise-making have broken down in various ways. After all, money is also an institution of promise-making, but it has broken down in all sorts of ways. Then, that is the grounds for critique, but I'm not suggesting that is easily fixed. But I nevertheless don't want to sound like a sort of hopeless cynic about this.
Wonderful. I mean, I could keep asking questions because I find this fascinating, but we have about 20 minutes left, and I'd like to give people here a chance to engage if they would so like. Are there questions here? Yeah, David down here. You want to grab a mic? And I think there should be people running mics around as well.
That may be the dud one.
I think this one is on. Thank you both for that. I actually wanted to ask if you wouldn't mind following up a bit on that last point, because in hearing you describe the crisis of authority and the crisis of the legitimacy of authority, it did occur to me that there is perhaps baked into this widespread skepticism a real opportunity for greater understanding of science, for one thing, for greater understanding of what it is these various scientific communities and intellectual communities through the years have been attempting to promote. On the face of it, at least, if you abstract it from the political context, there doesn't seem, to me at least, to be anything inherently undoable about asking the members of those communities, however difficult it may be for them given their training, to engage in the sort of rational persuasion, if you will, that's required in order to show whatever it is previous generations of them might have thought the public would just accept on the basis of the fact that they're experts or that they've achieved some sort of consensus. So is there further brainstorming that can be done in terms of thinking about what exactly that might look like in practice? I know you alluded to it, but maybe
yeah.
a bit
I mean,
more.
it's not a field I work in, because there is a whole field of the study of science communication and of the public understanding of science, and how to kind of reduce some of those gaps. I think you're right, first of all, that crises have a kind of there's a sort of fertility in crises when it comes to these things. And you saw this in the wake of the financial crisis. For a few years, there was a whole debate about the scope of economics, and there was books such as David Graeber's Debt was published not long after. No one had ever really thought, what is money and what is debt and what is credit? I mean, Graeber, no doubt himself had, but that book was a big seller, and it was popular in the Occupy movement and so on. So there's a sort of denaturalization that happens during these moments of crisis. I think obviously it's hard to get. Another time when we had to obviously think about this was in relation to COVID and epidemiology and vaccination and so on, where one of the problems there is to sort of almost to resuscitate an idea of society in the absence of, against a backdrop of sort of 40 years of neoliberal reforms, which had sort of said there's no such thing, to think epidemiologically about the world required people to recognize that they are a member of a society. As far as these kind of communities themselves are concerned, I think I don't have any particular kind of advice on sort of how that might be done. I mean, one thing that's interesting to me is what forms of how. I mean, I talk in the book briefly, and actually Roger was saying that this is something that sort of various students and so on have been interested in. Is I discussed the March for Science, which is something that happened in 2017, I guess, not long after Trump took office, and that was where scientists kind of took to the streets and held up banners and this sort of stuff. Now, one of the kind of interesting things about that as a phenomenon was that in some ways it sort of, on one level, it kind of played into the hands of those who claimed, oh, well, this is just a sort of one other sort of niche community, and they all kind of know each other, and it's a sort of they're not disembodied, and they are actual people with desires and passions and emotions. I mean, my argument in the book is that, in some sense, that this is inevitable now. There is no other way than to launch some of these things. But the question is, to what extent might some of these sorts of movements also be allied to projects for effectively the sort of rescuing of sustainable life in one way or another, in the sense of anchoring some of these things, particularly something like climate science, not simply in sort of abstractions about sort of CO2 in the atmosphere, but about the capacity to allow people to live sort of sustainable lives without risks of certain kinds, and to build up sort of political alliances with other forms of social movement of one kind or another. So, I mean, that doesn't kind of in itself get scientists out of their labs, but I think that the question is of sort of how to exercise persuasion and how to exercise reason as opposed to sort of brute rationality and brute sort of epistemic sort of power, I think necessarily involves trying to relate to the sort of real threats and fears that people feel of various kinds. But again, I don't know about how you actually, engage with some of these communities.
Yeah. Right? And just once. You're suddenly in this position where scientists are actually becoming more like politicians, and that has a tendency to undo the crisis of authority that was talked about in the question.
I mean, the question is sort of what might an alternative technocracy look like that is not the technocracy as exhibited by, say, the central banker, who is this sort of, as I say, the sort of fusion of sovereignty and knowledge, but a different technocracy.
Okay, I see a lot of questions. Anne, there, and then Tobias up there, and we'll get some more in. Let's take 2 questions, if that's all right. And can you do that? We'll do Anne and Tobias, and then we'll do 2 more.
Thanks very much. You began this remarkably interesting conversation by saying that neuroscientists have discovered or decided that all thought is rooted in feeling. And I find that really fascinating. And then that idea just sort of disappears. And I think it begins to come back in your distinction between rationality and reason. And I'm assuming that reason is allowed to include feeling as one of the ways in which we understand why we do things or why we want things. But I wonder if you have any way of thinking in how, let's see, somehow feeling or affect has been discouraged as a political tool, and when it is a political tool, it becomes quite violent, as we've seen. Do you think about this, how to fold in feeling or affect into reason in terms of action? I just wanted to add that for me, just one other thing, which is intuition and imagination seem to me part of that question. I mean, as part of what we're talking about feeling, not just I feel sad, but what are the possibilities for things like the imagination and intuition to play a part?
I was really interested in your remarks about in the financial crisis and the expert claims of the state blurring with the legal ones, and think, of course, right now, as you mentioned, with the FDA and increasingly with the central bank and the Federal Reserve. And I imagine that we're thinking about those claims as problematic because we think that they made the wrong ones, or at least the effects ended up being very problematic for a lot of people. I was curious if you think there is a technocracy that can be imagined where the outcome is virtuous and desirable, and would we make such claims if that happened?
Thank you. Thanks both of you for great questions. On the first one, thank you for returning me to my starting point, which is helpful, because as you say, it was a bit of it was sort of left hanging. But you're right about thinking about this in relation to reasons. I mean, I think my point about the sort of way we think of ourselves as neural creatures increasingly, rather than sort of classically modern as bearers of minds. I mean, in some ways, I was interested there in that this is very unsettling for modern ideals of knowledge, which in the kind of classically modern ideal, the mind acts as, in Richard Rorty's terms, as a kind of mirror of nature, so that it holds up a sort of, it's not part of nature, and it can therefore represent nature rather than be sort of influenced by it. Whereas as emotional neural creatures, yes, we are swayed by things, we are moved by things, but we, as you say, we don't lose our reasons for doing things. We're still capable of offering reason for things, and we constantly give our emotions as reasons for doing things, or we should do. I mean, if we don't, then we probably have some sort of delusion of sort of empty rationality. When it comes to anger, as we've talked about quite a lot actually today, anger is potentially a good way of establishing reasons for action. If you know what you're angry about, then that provides you with reasons for doing what you're doing. And anger can be a very good linkage between the suffering of some sort of injury or injustice and then the response. But that's if anger gets rooted via a mixture of embodied affect, but also via the conscious mind in the form of reasons that are known to one. Of course, there are lots of circumstances in which that doesn't happen. A lot of when we're angry, we don't know why we're angry. We don't actually know what we're angry with. It would be nice to think that anger always works via reasons, and it certainly can do, and I think it's very politically potent when it does. But I think one of the ways in which I've tried to think about this elsewhere in in some other work, not in the book, is to think about this in terms of the speed of anger. And there's anger where we suffer some injury in the past, and it sort of sits there and sediments, and we try to deny it, we try to ignore it. Eventually it becomes sort of a sort of depressive anger, an anger that we almost refuse to accept. And it might then come out in some way that we don't understand, and that might be something like psychoanalysis can sort of help to kind of explore what some of those linkages are and to start to find reasons where previously they've been absent. But then there's a sort of anger which I think is the anger that when we talk about the rage of social media, it's kind of the opposite. It's a sort of real-time, sort of meaningless, unreasoned anger, which is sort of, just purely sort of this kind of like the sort of Trumpian performing out of just sort of blasting out of sort of rage as pure performance almost a sort of empty kind of wildness, really. So I think the question is, how do we find something in between? And I think maybe we think about that temporally. Maybe we can sort of start to think a bit about kind of where our emotions come from, why we feel like we do, but try to take those emotions seriously, to hang on to them for long enough that we can think about them and reason about them, but not so long that they sort of turn toxic and start to kind of eat us up in some way that allows them not to be acted upon. There's actually some research on right-wing populism in Europe showing that people who are prone to vote for right-wing nationalists like Marine Le Pen and the Vox Party in Spain and Salvini in Italy and so on have very high feelings of injustice and very low feelings of political efficacy. And I don't know exactly how those two things are sort of kind of measured, but there's a sense that all is wrong with the world and I can't do anything about it. And it's that combination that makes a figure like Salvini or Vox or AfD or whatever to suddenly become appealing. And that is a mixture of having probably very good reasons why one is outraged, but having completely lost sight of the capacity to do anything about them. And I think that I think we need to sort of think these things through quite carefully to recognize that anger can be a very good grounds for, can be allied to reason, but it's also quite difficult to maintain that. And I think taking emotions seriously as part of our political reasons for what we do and don't believe in is absolutely essential. And I think that, and I think it sounds like we agree on that. On the issue of technocracy, the point about the financial crisis and the bailout of the banks in September 2008, and then things like quantitative easing from 2009, wasn't necessarily that they were the wrong thing to do. Maybe they were the wrong thing to do. It's that some of those decisions were taken at such speed that there was no possible way that they could be embedded in any form of public sphere, and no attempt was made to embed them in any kind of public sphere as well. The empowering of central banks since 2008 to the point where they effectively are sort of parallel sovereigns to Treasury departments and the rest of the states is, I think, a sort of one of the most significant transformations in the liberal state that the financial crisis has occasioned. And I think that it's the sense in which issues of the greatest public concern and decisions which are, in the pure sense, sovereign decisions, because they are decisions in the sense that, as someone like Carl Schmitt would have recognized, as the decision to simply to act without having to kind of explain or apologize or defend. This is what was so toxic about this. And I think this is what, in complicated ways, set off a series of developments on the right. Obviously there's all sorts of other reasons why the right has taken the strange and toxic paths that it has over the last 14 years. But I think that sort of seclusion of sovereignty behind the closed doors of technocracy is really the bigger problem. The question of what a different technocracy might look like, for starters, it has to be a technocracy that behaves that moves more slowly than that. And that it has to move more slowly than that for the same reasons that we believe scientific expertise should move more slowly than that, which is that it becomes the basis in which critique, peer review, deliberation, and transparency are possible. And I think that that's what I mean about this sort of collapse of the sort of Hobbesian sovereign state and the sort of, expert elite into these kind of corridors of sort of elite decision has been absolutely disastrous for the legitimacy of the liberal state in various ways. It's not the decision itself. Of course, you know, a perfectly designed democracy could take appalling decisions. I mean, this is the risk we run as people who look to politics for our answers rather than to economics, and that's you know. So.
Other questions in the middle there, down here, 1 and 2. We'll take 2 more questions here.
I'm going to go first because I have the microphone, whoever's back there. Thank you so much. This is fascinating. I was wondering if you wanted to say anything about the idea of responsibility, and specifically like responsibility for the world. Thinking about like the relationship of scientists and that kind of creating of facts and things we ought to do, the role of politicians. When you were talking about kind of right-wing or the appeal of authoritarianism, when one is both a sense of injustice but also a lack of political efficacy. If it's similar, you know, I think a lot of us on the left feel an equal amount of efficacy, you know, a sense of like, does my vote matter? But is there a different kind of like approach to the world and approach to responsibility for the world that might be underlying that?
Thanks very much for your talk, which I found very interesting. So if one accepts that trust is necessary for democratic politics, that's a successful, nonviolent, non-coercive, maybe liberal democratic politics, I'm wondering if one can ask whether, or if it's helpful to ask whether, what comes first, the trust or reasons to trust? And if one asks the question that way, and one could ask that question about those 17th century clubs as well, but all the way down the line. If one asks the question that way, does that then tell us something about what we think reason is? And then does that then tell us something about what might be necessary to establish the kind of trust that would be necessary for a successful democratic politics?
Those are two great questions, and I think, yeah, I mean, on the first one, this is a very interesting point, and you know, I think obviously there's this question of responsibility for the world. I think that there's more to it than this, but I think that, you know, partly there is I suppose an optimism that the left tries to hang on to, that a wider set of emotions is possible as the basis of democracy than fear and violence. That it is possible just by pointing to examples of where solidarity works, where perhaps in theory it shouldn't, but look, it does work in some way. You know, there's a sort of sense in which, against the arguments of, say, the Hobbesian or the economist or whatever, the game theorist, you know, that solidarity is not possible in various ways, which is to notice that it is possible and to see that as the grounds for trying to establish more of it in some ways. Whether that's about trying to cultivate responsibility. When I hear the word responsibility, I suppose there are different ways of hearing it. I think of something, I immediately think of sort of individual responsibility, which sort of sounds a bit like sort of, you know, trying to kind of like, you know, like trying to pin people's blame on people in some way. That's a completely, maybe that says more about me that I hear that, but you know, there's a sort of, that term, yes, I mean, we do have responsibility, and we have responsibility to future generations and to people we've never met and these sorts of things. But I think that, to me, first and foremost, there's a sort of perhaps it's just sort of the good fortune of one's experiences or something that the left perhaps sees and believes evidence more than some of the sort of more kind of, you know, than some sort of more hateful, because after all, we're not talking about everyone on the right, we're talking about a particular phenomenon of sort of radical and potentially violent right-wing populism. that solidarity is feasible and worth defending and worth growing. But I think in terms of this issue of sorry, I've slightly lost my train of thought. But I think sorry, it's a good question, and I'm now slightly lost the train of what I was going to say. But thank you. I mean, this issue of trust. Wow. I mean, that's a very sort of that's a brilliant and quite dense question. I think that it's I mean, I think there's an issue about. I mean, so to go back to these 17th century sort of precedents, they both were concerned with this sort of what you might call the a priori of trust. You might say, what is it what makes trust possible before there are even sort of reasons for trust in some way? So for Hobbes, it's almost like you almost have to imagine a complete leap into a civil society in which then it's possible to have other reasons for trusting and so on, but the precedent has to somehow kind of come first. You have to sort of always already be in such a situation. It's very difficult to see how the transition from a state of violence into a state of civil society would actually work, other than just as a sort of thought experiment. The point about the elite expert societies is, and this is what I think, the history of this is, why the history of this is quite interesting, is that one might say that, yes, they had reasons for trusting each other because they had their sort of, they had their books, or it's like the mercantile bookkeepers were able to trust one another's books. But the interesting thing about these societies set up as gentlemen's clubs was that there were fairly palpable reasons why these sorts of people were prone to trust other similar sorts of people. They were people of a certain, these were people of a certain cultural identity. And in that sense, there was something prior to their grounds of trust. Look, it's a terrific question, and I'm not sure certainly if I can answer it right now, but I think it raises a lot of additional questions, because if you only, I was just thinking I was going to start talking about Bitcoin, which is not something I fully understand, but Bitcoin, I mean, there is a sort of a libertarian kind of game theorist perspective on this, which is we can just sort of artificially design trust instruments out of thin air, and then sort of non-trusting people can kind of come together and magically kind of get along and trust one another. Now, clearly that is not an adequate solution to the broader kind of problems of trust and democracy, and it reduces a complex philosophical and political question down to a wholly instrumental one of, can we just design these sort of trust instruments, which is clearly, I think, not adequate to some of the sorts of the problems on the scale that I'm articulating. But thank you for the question anyway.
I mean, there's the technological element, which I think Colin McGill, to some extent, will talk about tomorrow. To what extent you can design technologies of trust and authority, right? That will be the talk tomorrow. And by the way, just so we all know, we're switching the times tomorrow. The 11:45 talk that was supposed to be by Francis Haugen is now going to be at 2:30, and Colin's 2:30 talk is going to be at 11:45. Just so you know. But it does stream, dialogic ideas, right? The idea that through dialogue groups and through town hall meetings, but also through kind of citizen assemblies, you can build trust. You can build trust. The question is, how do you then create that trust in the larger society? And I don't know the answer to that. Please join me in thanking Will Davies.